Morning, everybody. It's John from Veganism Kills. Let's get your date and time. It's 5/19, October 29th, Thursday. And I want to talk about a subject that just seems to slip by about veganism. A lot of people think it's about the animals and nutrition, which it utterly fails at. But I don't know why anybody has touched on this, why they did not touch on this before, about what Joey Strong did to Anonymous Voices, or Anonymous for the Voiceless. And from what I understand, if you watch this video, you can go also watch the videos from Cranky Vegan. You will see the debacle that's going on. In other words, the anonymous investor, which I can guarantee is also an angel investor in these vegan businesses, and they're trying to cover it up because they don't want you to know who he is, asked Joey Carbstrong to go over to Anonymous for the Voiceless and asked him, we want to see all your bank statements, your records, how much, everything totally financial. We want access to all unrestricted access to all your records. Now, this man's got employees he's responsible. Their social security numbers, bank accounts, and everything. I'm sorry. I am not handing over that kind of information to an ex-con. Joey's an ex-con. Drug dealing and being unlawfully armed with deadly weapons. Alright? I'm not giving him my bank statements. Nobody in their right mind would give anybody their bank statements. So Joey cut their funding. Now the amount of funding is the question. This is one channel. And guess how much funding this channel is getting? $1.5 million. And this is Joey's statement. Actually, it's $2,195,000 in AOD. The budget agreed by the donor was $1.5 million. This is $1.5 million from one donor to one of these vegan talking head channels. 1.5. There's a lot of money involved here. So if you're, I don't believe anything Freely says, any of them, because these vegan talking heads on YouTube were sponsored and paid a lot of money. Just this one channel is raking in $1.5 million in donations from one donor. One donor to tell you you're bad if you eat meat. And I want to know who that donor is. So let's go over Joey Carbstrong's reply. The following is a statement in response to the recent situation with Anonymous for the Voiceless. I can tell you right now, reading this, Joey Carbstrong did not write this. He's a drug-addled ex-con, and all of a sudden he can grasp enough to understand paragraphs. Okay? Somebody wrote this for him. If he could write this well, he wouldn't be on the streets robbing, stabbing people, and selling drugs. Firstly, I want to address the claim by Paul and Asa from AV that I set out to cancel AV. This accusation is damaging and untrue. I am collaborating with and promoted AV across my channels from day one. I had an AV link in my YouTube channel for years and had a segment on AV outreach in nearly all my speeches encouraging activists to join. First of all, I do not care if you encourage somebody to promote one of your branches of veganism, all right? You guys are working under the same donor. You're the manager. Of course, you're going to promote a branch of your business. So let's go over that first one. This is a major money-making business that they got going on here. And AV was nothing but a branch of what Joey Carbstrong was the manager of this little criminal enterprise that's defrauding people out of millions and trying to get people to buy vegan products that don't do anything for the human nutrition and has actually killed several people. All right? What happened was a major donor had concerns with AV and the relationships between the donor Paul Asa were breaking down. Okay, let me tell you something. That is no reason if the relationship between Paul and Asa were breaking down. There's no reason to start sticking your nose in their personal business and trying to relate it to business expenses and such. This came to a head after AV published a controversial Black Lives Matter protest post, which upset many people and resulted in a number of complaints to AV's donor. So they said something negative about Black Lives Matter. So there you go. They said something negative about Black Lives Matter at another SJW group, and the SJWs got upset, and Joey's donor received complaints and pulled the funding. So he's telling you the truth right there. That's all it is. This was compounded by other concerns. Yeah, but that was the main concern. They put up a post that was negative about Black Lives Matter, probably burning and destroying everything. And your donor got complaints, ran back and pulled their funding. There goes the truth, right there. You put it in there, Joey. You know, these people are mindless. Veganism is another SJW branch. This was compounded by other concerns, including AV groups not receiving funding from Paul and Assel. Okay, this is what I'm concerned about. I think Paul and Assel turned around and realized they were giving money to groups, Black Lives Matter, and they decided not to because of watching the destruction they were doing. So if they didn't want to give money so Black Lives Matter can go loot, rape, and burn and commit crimes like that, I would say they were being very ethical. But you see, veganism is not about that. Veganism is a branch of SJW nonsense, okay? So here you go. So whoever, that's why they don't want you to know who the donor is, because then you realize they're funding money through these talking vegan head channels, and they're passing it on to these terrorist groups. And he's telling you right here, they said something negative about Black Lives Matter, and it was compounded, including AV groups not receiving funding. So it turned out that they didn't like what Black Lives Matter was doing, so they didn't forward the funding to them, so they wouldn't go out and start shooting and killing people. After much consideration, the donor reached out to me to help and try to resolve this matter. In other words, the donor wants you to give the money that he's giving you to these little branch groups of SJW Black Lives Matter groups. They refused after seeing what Black Lives Matter was doing out in the street and held on to the funding. The donor got some complaints from the troops in the street. They weren't getting any rocks to throw at people or bricks. The brick pallet didn't show up, and they cut their funding. As a friend of the donor, so this is a friend of Joey Carbstrong. I was asked to be involved because I had no ill feelings towards AV and the fact of being a longtime friend and supporter of the work. No, AV fell out of line, didn't support these radical groups, didn't give them their funding, the trickle down from the donor through AV to them, because AV didn't believe that they should be supporting a terrorist group. Further, I had experience and understanding with grassroots activism on the ground. There you go, grassroots activism. Peaceful protesters. The goal was to help AV continue to receive their funding and work with them fulfilling the donor's request for financial transparency. So these guys are going out there telling AV, hey, if you don't friggin' pass the money on to these grassroots activists that are out there throwing bricks through people's windows and lighting shit on fire, you're a bad boy. You're going to lose your funding. and this is $1.5 million. Although I was a little taken aback by this request to get involved, I assumed as a non-profit organization they would be open, honest, and compliant to regain the trust of the donor. It's not the trust to the donor. The donor wanted them to do a certain thing with the funds. They found out that these little grassroots groups were related to Black Lives Matter, going out there and burning things down. They're afraid to say anything because they'll get attacked. All right? And they said, you know what? We can do without your money because we're not supporting this violence on the street. Keep your money. The impression given by AV was their funding started this year, although they did receive a large amount of funding in 2019 as well. The budget agreed by the donor was $1.5 million. That was to be paid in blocks of 100 USD roughly every 3 weeks. Every 3 weeks, they're getting 100,000. Let's take a look at the calculator, exactly what these people are getting to pass on to these terrorist groups. These people woke up. They didn't like it. You got 52 weeks in a year, divided by 3, times it by 100,000. Almost $2 million. So what's going on here is you have a front where the donor is telling these people you'll get funding for the vegan outlook, and then these people are told, okay, you got these other groups that are under you. These people find out that those groups are Black Lives Matter terrorist groups. They refuse to give the funding to them because of the violence they're perpetrating on the street. Donor gets complaints when these groups don't receive their funding from AV. AV goes, we're activists, but we don't approve of this kind of activism. But they're throwing shade because they don't want to be attacked by those same activists. But the activists have went and complained to the donor. This donor needs to be exposed because he's basically sponsoring terrorism. All right? This is really bad, people. This is really bad. Veganism is a scam. It's a lie. It's a grassroots SJW operation in which they're funneling money to these vegan channels to the people that are out in the streets burning, looting, and killing people. And that's why the donor wants to be anonymous. These people went ahead and said, we heard of AV publish a controversial Black Lives Matter protest post. Okay? Now, they put up a post that upset many people and resulted in a number of complaints to AV's donor. This was compounded by including AV groups not receiving funding. You in your right mind, if you have ethics, would you fund a group that's going to take a brick and smash somebody's head in for no reason other than wearing a red hat? So now we can see how the money's being funneled to these terrorist organizations that are out in the street. And that's what it is. You can see it right there. Black Lives Matter didn't get their money from AV. This donor's got to be exposed. Joey Carbstrong needs to be locked the fuck up. Okay. The main financial concerns included the breakdown in salary costs, $946,000. The AV fund, $360,000, which a number of AV groups said they haven't received. The high cost of developing an app, $150K. The large touring campaign budget, $300K in a year when the travel was restricted because of COVID. They also never readjusted the travel budget to suit the current situation of all travel being restricted. You know something? This is funny. Just because they have a large touring campaign budget, $300,000 a year, and they put the money that they put in there every year for travel, doesn't mean they spent it, Joey. You retard. I work for a big corporation. If they allot in the budget for $500,000 to travel, Just because it's COVID-19 out there doesn't mean the money doesn't go into the bank account in which it's intended for. It just doesn't get spent. These are the idiot vegans that think they know how to operate a corporate structure. Operation, there was also concerns with Alcel being the only treasurer and her handling all the funds and payroll. Well, I got news for you. There should only be one. You got more than one person coming into your treasury. You see, when I was working at Chase, I was responsible for all the money going in and out of the bank. I had signature authority. Everything went past me because I was trusted, and if I seen something suspicious being handed over to me, it was my job to confront it. You don't decentralize the operational funds to every Dick, Tom, and Harry that you don't know. So right there's something going on. For the founder to have sole responsibility, well, if the founder's supposed to have sole responsibility, you ever hear the expression, the buck stops here? For these functions in an organization of this size and income, it's only $1.5 million. It did raise the concern it's not best practice for demonstrating strong financial controls. Yes, it is demonstrating strong financial controls. If you have one officer responsible for all the finance of the company, in other words, the buck stops here. If you have a problem, that's the person responsible. Not this guy over there, not this guy over there, this guy over there. Joey doesn't know what he's talking about. In most charities, there's an independent board of trustees who oversee the organization, operation, financial stability. I got news for you. If you have trustees, they got to be paid. If you're setting this up like a college fund, are you kidding me? This is not the case with AV. First of all, trustees. How many trustees do you think they're going to have? Two. They're the only people that sit on the board of the company are still going to be the same people that are controlling the budget anyway, you idiot. Joey, you see, this was written by an SJW who never worked a day in his life in any corporation. This is not the case with AV where there was a lack of financial accountability. No, there was total accountability going to one person instead of many. If one of those people that sat on the board decided to abscond some money, everybody's going to start pointing fingers at one another, and you're going to have total loss, and nobody's going to be held accountable because nobody's going to know who stole the fucking money. I know. I used to be the control of Citibank, of high net worth clients, private banking. It was me who knew where the money was. Everything went through me. All the accounting went through me. If this money was sent from A to go to C, and that money didn't get to C, it was my job to see where that money was and who was handling it and fix it or find out what they were doing. You're a financial controller. The people got $1.5 million. You know how much a financial controller makes a year? You got that much money in your budget, Joey? You pay for them to have a financial controller then. You hire them. You give them the extra money. It's not the case with AV. There was a lack of financial account. All funds are received and distributed by Paul and also as they see fit, with no oversight by anyone else in the organization. If they are the responsible two, the top two dogs, and if they're sitting there doing this out of their own time, one's the chief financial officer and one's the CEO of this particular company, then they're doing it the right way. How do you delegate a company to use the funds, which is a very responsible position, to one of your underlings? Then if they do something wrong, you're responsible. If they decide to clean out the account and leave. After back and forth deliberation with AV, the donor, Paul, and also refused to give any type of transparency the donor was requesting. Because the donor wanted to make sure his BLM buddies on the street were getting their money so they could buy bricks to throw through people's windows. Paul and also refused. We had the support of a professional accountant. That's why you see Paul making these funny faces when they say that you thought veganism was just about protect the voices of the animals. No, he found out your donor was using them as a front to give money to radical violent groups. But Paul's afraid to say it. I know this stuff. I went to military war college. Funding a terrorist organization is usually an underhanded situation where you set up companies and you pass money somehow to these little organizations you got running in the street to overthrow a government. And in this place, he was trying to use anonymous voices to do so. How if they put if they put something negative about BLM's violent activities, and then you're telling them to donate money, pass the donation on to them, and they refuse. I don't blame them. It's supposed to be about compassion, ethics, and the animals, and they're seeing something different, but they're afraid to say it. I'm not. I know exactly what's going on here. So what you got here is an SJW grassroots movement that's pretending it's all about veganism and stuff, and all they are is another branch of SJW. This donor that's trying to remain anonymous wants to know why those BLM people did not receive their donation from AV. And the reason why they didn't get their donation from AV because AV disapproves of the violent actions that are going on. That's why he makes the comment, this man right here makes the comment, I thought veganism's supposed to be about the animals and ethics. And here is the donor funneling money through this vegan organization to these violent BLM protesters out on the street. It's all uncovered. I could tell. I've seen this before. This has the marks of tradeware if I haven't seen it. All right? In our first call, Paul said they've been putting away money for a rainy day. That's why they didn't spend any of the money for travel. Though they put it in the account, they just didn't travel. They have a budget every year for travel. If it's $300,000 and they put the money in the place where they keep the money for travel, doesn't mean they used it. That's why he means we put the money away for a rainy day. So, in other words, when COVID lifts, then we'll start traveling. So putting the money in the fund doesn't mean you were misappropriating it. You have a budget that's set. You got your money set up. This much for this much for that, this much for this. Just because you're not using it doesn't mean you don't allot the fund. Just because you're not traveling doesn't mean you don't put the travel money in the travel account. And that's why the budget numbers might be higher than their actual spend. So, in other words, what the guy is telling them, this is simple. I understand, Paul, right off the back. You don't necessarily have to spend the money once you put it in an account. Okay? If you have an account in your books that says this is for travel, it doesn't mean you spent it. It's just saying you're allocated to the money to travel if and when it happens. But it doesn't mean you took the money. You see, this is what's wrong with Joey. He doesn't understand. He's an ex-con. I wouldn't give him my books either. He'd probably steal the money. There's a high probability. All right. After I said to Paul, this might not look good if you have reserve money that you haven't declared to the donor. He doesn't have to declare it to the donor. The donor gave him the money. That's it. The donor has, after you give somebody a donation, you have no right to ask what you do with that donation. If that was the case, Hillary Clinton would be in jail for the Haitian relief funds. All the guy did, you see, as far as I could tell, Paul did the same thing every corporation does. There's a certain amount of money that comes out of the budget that's allotted to travel. It's put in the travel expense account. All it does is reimburse people's travel expenses. But if nobody's traveled, the money's just going to sit there in the account for its attendant until it's used. Its intended use. You don't have to declare it if you didn't spend it. I could see if there was expenses coming out of the account, and then you can ask. But if the money's just sitting there and nobody's really traveled, it's just going to sit there. It's not being spent. It's not being used. This guy doesn't. They don't understand because they don't have no experience. They just run by emotions. Okay. It might look like reserve money, but it's not. He misworded it. Okay, I allocated 300,000 for travel expenses, but obviously we haven't used any. It's just sitting in the account. Okay? But when you treat somebody like he's a crook, you're gonna get a nasty answer. And sorry, there's no way that Joey, with his friggin' a low IQ and his lack of schooling, is gonna understand what the guy's trying to tell him. I understand perfectly what this guy said. We get 1.5 million. $300,000 goes to travel. Even though we might not travel at all this year because of COVID-19, the money's still there for travel. If anything, you're supposed to ask about, let me see your travel expenses. We don't have any. Well, how can you prove that? Well, the money we allotted to travel is still sitting in the account. That's it. End of story. This this is because I can tell you right now, they made it up. These guys didn't give the money to the Black Lives Matter groups because of the violence they were committing on the street. That's why the friggin' donor pulled the funding. I want to know who that donor is. Although they might be have needed the donor at the beginning, they won't necessarily need them anymore and go on without them. Because the donor was trying to force them to funnel money to Black Lives Matter, and Paul decided, you know what, we don't need a person like that. That's where you got. Tell the fucking truth, Joey. Your fucking donor was telling them to give money to these grassroots organizations, and they found out some of these organizations are BLM, who are outside terrorizing the country as we speak, burning down stuff. They don't want to take part of it. Tell the truth, Joey, you scumbag. And they're afraid to say it. I'm not. Okay? This didn't make sense as they had so many staff. They say they have 30 and no reserve of funds, yet they would rather let go of the main source of funding instead of giving us the transparency they were looking for. This did ring alarm bells with me, and it seems that they would lose the 1.5 million USD, then comply with the donor's request, essentially defunding the whole AV. If somebody was giving you $1.5 million and you're supposed to be about protecting the animals and ethics and morals and all this stuff, and they tell you to take some of that money and pass it on to this terrorist organization, but keep my name anonymous, okay? Because Joey's all about the violence, the overthrow. That's Joey. Violence. Go in there and be aggressive. It just fits the narrative with these SJWs. I would refuse the money too. I'd say get lost. Go find some other lapdog to funnel your money through. I don't want to go to jail if they crack down and they find out you don't has been funding terrorist groups. And I don't want to be the bag boy for them. That's what happens. AV didn't want to be the bag boy for this donor to feed these terrorist groups money. I think Joey needs to be investigated and locked up. I could smell this from a mile away. Look at this black. It came to the head after AV published a controversial Black Lives Matter protest post, which upset many people and resulted in never complaints to the AV donor. So they posted something negative about Black Lives Matter when they found out some of the grassroots groups that the donor was asking them to fund with the money they gave to them outside the purpose he gave it to them for, and they refused. They told him to take a walk. Then they pulled the funding to save face. The money the donor gives is for the animals. Okay? You, so they're going to, right now, just looks like the cat's out of the bag, so Joey's going to flip it and say they were giving the money to the Black Lives Matter and the donor didn't want him to. I can tell you exactly where this is going, what Joey's trying to flip on these people. This money the donor gives for the animals, and if they're not 100% confident in where the funding is going, then they have every right to stop funding, as everyone does. So they refuse to give money to Black Lives Matter, grassroots group, or some kind of group that says, we're BLM, but we're vegan. The donor has never defunded an organization like this before, so the circumstances were unique. AV was reluctant to take suggestions from the donor, showed arrogance, and spoke with contempt towards almost all involved. Of course, they spoke with contempt for all involved, because they knew what you were doing when they looked into the Black Lives Matter groups that you were asking them to give money to. These grassroots activists. You didn't. They're probably not even vegan activist groups. And that's what they had a problem with. But again, these two people for Anonymous for the Voiceless are afraid to say anything. So Joey's a paid shill for these SJW groups. He's an organizer. You see him organizing all these protests in supermarkets and stuff. They're also funneling money for the other protests. Also, for them to compare my Patreon, my YouTube, and rather modest amounts I receive from the donor with help for a few staff, 2 full-time staff, and some occasional freelancers, and travel when needed to an organization with 2.2 AUD a year income is nowhere comparable and extremely misleading on their part. I don't believe it, Joey. I know you're getting more money than that. I know you are. Let's see your books, Joey, because I don't believe you. If he's given 1.5 million to these guys he don't know through you, and you're the donor's friend, I believe you're getting substantially more. That's just ludicrous. If you're a linchpin, if you're going in and organizing these groups, and you're actually the go-between, you're telling me, please get out of here. With your reputation as a public charity or a major donor, one public charity with one major donor, which they won't disclose. Anonymous for the Voiceless decides we don't want to be used as a conduit to to privately fund these radical groups that are out there. They refuse to do it. And it all began because they put up something negative about BLM. Some of the groups BLM groups didn't get their money that they were told to pass on. AV was told to pass on to them. They called up and complained to the donor. The donor tells Joey, hey, look, what's going on with the money that I sent that they were supposed to give to this BLM group in this city, that city, wherever they're close to. They were supposed to give the money. How come they didn't do it? That's what this is about. Read between the lines, people. Paul also made some incredibly damaging claims about my intentions when I was trying to help them. Yeah, you were trying to help them. You wanted to know why. Joey, you're right up there with all about the violence, Joey. You're all about the drug. You're not a secret agent, Joey. I tried my best to help AV to come an amicable solution. No, you didn't. An ex-con coming to an amicable solution. They'll probably stab you in the chest first. With the donor, so AV could continue receiving their funding, but the donor was very firm on their request for this time financial transparency, and the numbers were so high. First of all, again, I'll state it again, this knucklehead doesn't know how a corporation runs. Obviously, Animal for the Voiceless does know how it runs. When you get the donation, and I put the money in the account for travel expenses, doesn't mean the money was spent on travel expenses. It was just put in an account for travel expenses. And you don't write it. You don't. It's not a loss. It's reserve funding. If you can understand the proper thing, it's reserve funding in case travel happens. That money's there for travel. We usually use this much a year. We allotted it into the expense account for travel. It's just that we haven't really spent any money yet. And it's totally over the head. That has nothing to do with it. It has to do that these grassroots vegan channels are supposed to be funneling money to these violent BLM protesters, and AV refused to do it. And that's why they were being arrogant. They were pissed off that you're promoting veganism, it's supposed to help the world, and yet you want them to give part of their funding to violent criminals, terrorists. No matter what. So there you go, people. The hidden underbelly of veganism exposed. This is very easy to see. Where is it going? Well, it was intended, some of the money was intended to go to BLM. Their mistake was, no, we don't want to give money to BLM. That falls out of the range of what we stand for. We're ethics and animals. Being moral, treating the animals well. It's veganism. So they're staying true to their mantra. And then the donors telling them, why haven't you given any money to these groups? Because they found out they were fucking funneling money to BLM. That's why Joey's donor and friend wants to be anonymous. These vegan organizations are funding terrorism. And if Joey Carbstrong wants to talk about it, it's very easy, Joey. Give me your donor's name, and we're going to ask Paul and Osler who exactly he was at, those grassroots organizations who were complaining they didn't receive their money, and why was it such an anxious situation when they turned around and said something negative about BLM. I'm out of here, people. This is disgusting. So there you go. The cover's blown in their own mouth. You can figure this out if you know anything about trade skills, all right? Again, this is right out of the SAS handbook of any military college. You read the handbook. How do you fund a violent group? You have to funnel money to them. How do you funnel money to them? A lot of times, I hate to say this, but a lot of times they'll funnel money to a church organization, a religious organization to fund terrorism. A large donation goes to the church, then it goes to these activist groups out in the street that are forming the rebellion. That's why you hear about in all of these communist countries or Sandinista countries, they're always killing priests. And I know somebody's actually whose parents did that. And I knew him for a little bit. And I knew right as soon as he told me who his parents were. And then I went to see how they were living. They were living large. So I knew what they were all about. They smelled their mannerisms, everything. I knew what those people were doing. And they knew that I knew. We have a certain way of knowing. And there's other people that I know that are involved in that too. And these people are unassuming, nice, smiling people. And you wouldn't believe some of the stuff that they're doing. These guys are engaging in funneling money to the vegan organizations to BLM violent terrorists. And there you go, people. Call it crazy, call it conspiracy. But if they don't think it is, I could talk to Joey for 5 minutes on a live feed. And I'm going to say, who is your donor? Who is your donor? You're talking about transparency? You want to know what they want to do with the money? I want to know who the fuck their donor is. All right. Later.